Instantly asserting central presence, this gambit opens diagonals and prepares swift development. Asserting territorial control on the queen side, black immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for dynamic counterplay. Opening the path for development, this knight immediately stakes a claim in the center. Developing this knight directly prepares for an aggressive Sicilian setup, contesting central pawns with immediate intent. This pawn thrust immediately challenges the center, aiming to open lines and exploit the central pawn chain's inherent tension. Opening the center this way invites sharp tactical skirmishes, demanding precise calculation from both sides. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately ignites central tension and prepares for rapid development. Challenging the center's knight with knight development, this move ignites the Sicilian's dynamic tension and prepares for counterplay. Developing the knight here tightens white's central grip and prepares for pawn pushes, creating a subtle territorial advantage. Solidifying central control and preparing to develop the bishop, this move sets a firm defensive structure. Nurturing piece development, the bishop now occupies a safe square, preparing for kingside castling and contributing to the central pawn structure's solidity. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to develop the kingside bishop to a more active square, this maneuver aims to secure black's central structure before potentially challenging white's control of the d4 square. Securing the monarch is paramount, and castling efficiently repositions the king behind a newly formed pawn shield, simultaneously activating the rook for future endeavors on the open files that may emerge. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for king safety are the immediate priorities, harmonizing the pieces for a defensive posture. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers a long-term positional advantage, eyeing the central dark squares and reinforcing the kingside's defensive structure. Securing the king under a shield of pawns is a fundamental step, preparing for the ebb and flow of battle by ensuring its immediate safety and readying it for a potential central advance later. Centering the bishop on the long diagonal, aiming its gaze toward black's castled king while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential queenside expansion, demonstrates a patient, positional approach, subtly tightening white's grip on the center. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this pawn advance subtly aims to restrict white's knight development and potentially establish a queenside majority later on. Securing the monarch from potential open diagonals is paramount, even in such a seemingly quiet Sicilian setup. Unleashing the queen to b6 immediately injects dynamism, putting pressure on white's d4 knight and indirectly eyeing the c2 pawn, potentially creating tactical complications and forcing white to choose between defending or developing further. Initiating a swift queenside expansion, the knight leaps to a3, eyeing immediate pressure on the unsupported black queen and potential infiltration along the c-file should it advance. This aggressive thrust not only probes black's position, but also prepares to challenge the active queen, forcing it to a less ideal square and potentially disrupting black's developing harmony. It's a bold move, embracing dynamic play over passive development. Safeguarding the queen from immediate skirmishes on the queen side allows black to solidify their pawn structure, a vital preparation for any future pawn pushes or consolidating central space. Clearing the knight from the active kingside square opens up new avenues for piece deployment and potentially targets the queen's current anchorage on a7. Opening the b-file for your rook, a promising positional concession for a more open game. Initiating a pawn thrust to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This aggressive push aims to gain central space and create imbalances. Breaking the central pawn structure with this exchange immediately opens lines and simplifies the position, demanding sharp calculation from both sides to navigate the resulting imbalances. Unlocking the central diagonal with the bishop opens up a powerful attacking corridor directly towards black's castled king, simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing further advances. The rook now ventures towards the open d-file, a natural assertion of influence on a central artery of the board. This aggressive placement aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially prepare for further infiltration, creating immediate tension. Securing the e5 pawn and preparing for a central expansion. This move pivots the queen to a more active diagonal while simultaneously eyeing potential threats against black's king and connected pawns. Black's decision to advance the pawn signals an attempt to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create queenside play, though it comes at the cost of weakening the pawn chain and allowing white greater central influence. This pawn push invites tactical skirmishes, where precision will be paramount for both sides. It's a double-edged sword, potentially opening lines for black's pieces, but also creating targets for white if not properly supported. Unlocking the c-file for the rook is the primary objective here, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the b-file and create potential pressure down that open lane. The bishop on a6 now occupies an active diagonal, potentially pressuring white's center and preparing to contest the b-file. The central pawn advance unleashes a territorial struggle, aiming to restrict black's queenside development and create potential weaknesses around the now doubled c-pawns, while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or piece redeployment. Black's bishop now eyes the crucial e4 square, challenging white's central pawn and aiming to disrupt the harmonious placement of white's pieces on the queenside, particularly the knight on c3. This maneuver is a bold gambit for central control and an attempt to leverage the doubled pawns. By placing the queen on the c-file, white intends to directly challenge black's queenside structure and create threats against the king's defenses. It's a sharp turn, sacrificing immediate pawn structure harmony for increased piece activity and potentially forcing concessions from black. Consider the ramifications of opening that c-file for black's rooks and how white plans to counteract that developing threat. Embarking on a quest to activate the knight towards the king's flank, this maneuver eyes potential harassment of the f2 square and aims to improve the piece's positional standing, setting the stage for future queenside or central operations. Recouping the bishop to b2 aims to shore up the queenside pawn structure and potentially re-establish influence over the now open queenside diagonal, creating a defensive bastion. Securing the critical d-file with the rook solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential advances or exchanges, while the knight on d7 remains poised for redeployment, potentially aiming for the c5 square to challenge white's queenside pawn structure. Sharpening the pawn structure on the queenside, this advance aims to disrupt black's queenside coordination and potentially gain space, while simultaneously limiting the scope of the c8 rook. The bishop retreats, no longer feeling the sharp pressure from white's advancing pawns and queen, preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal or perhaps support a future pawn push on the queenside. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside, this aggressive maneuver seeks to exploit the slight immobility of black's pieces and create immediate threats against the king's protective pawn structure. Challenging the central pawn structure head-on, black opts to dissolve the immediate tension with this advance, initiating a complex exchange that fundamentally alters the pawn dynamics. This creates an open e-file, which will undoubtedly become a focal point for future conflict, potentially opening lines towards white's king. Observe how this pawn push also opens a diagonal for the queen, albeit temporarily, and prepares for potential piece activity on the kingside. Opening up the d-file for immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure. Initiating a strategic pawn advance to disrupt the opponent's central pawn structure. This move boldly seeks to gain central space and potentially exploit weaknesses around white's king. The white queen's journey to f5 initiates a probing attack, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses around the king. This aggressive repositioning capitalizes on the open d-file, hinting at potential future tactical operations. Shifting the queen to c7 prepares a potential nb6 maneuver to harass the advanced e-pawn and simultaneously offers some support to the d7 knight, a sensible repositioning given the constricted queenside and white's looming initiative. Reclaiming the open c-file presents a clear advantage, pressuring black's queenside structure and preparing to infiltrate with rook activity. Strengthening the king's refuge by creating a defensive pawn structure. G6 attempts to shield the monarch from immediate tactical incursions, albeit at the cost of potentially weakening the light squares around the king, setting up a thematic weakness for future exploitation if black isn't careful with piece placement. A sharp check forcing black's king into a precarious position, potentially opening lines for white's powerful pieces and creating weaknesses around the enemy monarch. Securing the king's sanctuary by tucking it behind the pawn chain, this maneuver aims to shield the monarch from the immediate dangers lurking on the light squares, particularly the aggressive bishop on f3 and the queen's probing eye. While it relinquishes some central dynamism, the priority shifts to fortifying the king's immediate surroundings, a prudent decision given the open nature of the central files and the potential for swift tactical assaults. Opening the f-file with this pawn thrust is a bold attempt to shatter black's pawn structure, aiming to expose the king by creating immediate attacking possibilities. Accepting the pawn sacrifice opens up the e-file and intensifies the pressure on the d-file, forcing black into a defensive posture where their king's safety is becoming a paramount concern. A decisive sacrifice to pry open the defender's king position, this rook offering aims to dismantle the shield protecting g6 and expose the royal family to immediate danger. This capture is forced, but it ignites a whirlwind of tactical possibilities as white eyes the now exposed black king. Unleashing a deadly discovered attack, white leverages the pinning of the black queen and the exposed nature of the king on g7. The rook's sacrifice on d7 wasn't just about material exchange. It was a calculated maneuver to rip open lines and exploit the defensive deficiencies black has accumulated. The queen now steps onto f6, delivering check and forcing the king into an even more precarious position, threatening further mating sequences through immediate tactical opportunities. This aggressive thrust capitalizes on black's somewhat passive piece placement in the center and their failure to adequately defend the critical kingside squares. The black king, now exposed on the g-file, faces imminent danger. Clinging to the king's side provides no sanctuary as white's pieces are poised to exploit the weakened diagonals and open lines. Unleashing a devastating discovered check, white exposes black's monarch to immediate peril and simultaneously revitalizes the queen's attacking potential. This audacious thrust creates a double attack, forcing black into a desperate defense that will inevitably lead to material loss or further king exposure. The king, caught in the center of the board, finds no sanctuary as the knight's sacrifice pierces its defenses. The pressure on the black position becomes unbearable, with the open lines and powerful centralized pieces spelling doom. Relocating the monarch to the depths of his own territory feels like a desperate scramble, sacrificing vital central control and leaving the king exposed to an avalanche of white's attacking pieces, a decision that severely compromises black's defensive structure. The rook sacrifice on f4 is a brilliant stroke, dismantling black's pawn structure and forcing the black king into a hopelessly exposed position. White seizes the initiative decisively by opening lines toward the enemy monarch and leveraging the power of the bishop pair. This move fundamentally alters the board's dynamics, creating immediate threats and opening up a direct assault on the now vulnerable black king. The exposed king is a ticking time bomb, and the rook sacrifice accelerates its inevitable detonation. The queen's desperate repositioning attempts to shield the beleaguered king, but the discovered attack unleashed by the rook sacrifice has fundamentally altered the battlefield, leaving black in a precarious defensive posture. Disrupting the doubled pawn's defensive structure leads to an inevitable material gain, simplifying into a winning endgame where the passed f-pawn will prove decisive. Accepting the queen's sacrifice undeniably reshapes the board into a drastically simplified endgame, where the king's exposed position becomes the paramount concern. Seizing the initiative, white's queen pierces black's weakened kingside with a devastating discovered attack, forcing a pivotal exchange and simplifying into a winning endgame by eliminating black's last active defender. The desperate king scramble continues, but black's monarch is now terribly exposed on the open board, a stark contrast to white's consolidated pieces and overwhelming initiative. Unleashing a decisive attack, this check exploits the exposed black king, forcing a critical decision and clearing the path for further material gain. Embracing the exposed king's peril, this retreat seeks shelter, a desperate attempt to tuck away the monarch before the inevitable mating net tightens further. Unleashing a devastating queen sacrifice that cleaves open the king's defense, White initiates a forced sequence designed to shatter Black's remaining resistance and usher in a swift mating attack. The Black King, now exposed in the center after the queen's sacrifice, seeks refuge, but the open files and White's coordinated pieces present immediate danger. Securing this monarch amidst the tactical storm is paramount. Capitalizing on the exposed Black King, this audacious capture seizes a vital outpost and forces a favorable pawn exchange, simplifying towards a winning material advantage by decisively clearing the queenside. This strategic retreat aims to consolidate the king's position amidst the sudden tactical storm, but it leaves the monarch precariously exposed on the open B file, inviting further harassment from the rampant white queen and rook. Striking with the bishop, White exploits the exposed Black King, forcing a cascade of checks that will lead to decisive material gain. Unveiling the bishop's attack on the rook, this maneuver aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potentially disrupt White's king's safety, though it leaves the bishop somewhat exposed on a more active, yet less protected, diagonal. Unleashing a discovered check that forcefully dictates the enemy king's escape route, this move seizes a crucial outpost and simultaneously prepares to exploit the weakened dark squares surrounding Black's monarch. Uncovering the queen's retreat, this bishop relocation anticipates a potential queen sacrifice exchange, aiming to simplify into a more manageable endgame by neutralizing the attacking queen and preparing for a defensive maneuver of the monarch. Unleashing the knight to the central squares immediately puts pressure on the D6 pawn and potentially opens up lines for further attack on Black's somewhat exposed king position. Defending the bishop on B7 and preparing to challenge White's formidable rook on the 7th rank is the immediate task, though the king's exposure on the queen side leaves a lingering vulnerability. Unleashing a decisive tactical shot, White forces a liquidation of material that should lead to a winning endgame by eliminating Black's most active defender and opening lines for further pressure. A desperate attempt to regain some leverage by bringing the rook into play, but it's too late to fundamentally alter the course of this endgame. The initiative firmly belongs to White, who will now systematically dismantle Black's remaining defenses and convert the advantage. Initiating a decisive tactical sequence, the knight seizes an outpost on the 6th rank, forcing the opposing rook to a passive position and preparing to exploit the weakened pawn structure around the Black King.